Hello and welcome to episode number 40 of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Today is Sunday, March 8th, 2015. I'm Melissa Agnes, and this podcast is brought to you by Agnes Day. Let's talk crisis intelligence. Zahed, welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do?
Hi, my name is Zahed Amanullah. I'm a senior program manager at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a London-based think tank that is dealing with the ongoing problem of extremism, actually extremisms of all types. And we're working on a number of ways to help combat it in terms of communication and countering the propaganda that has been coming out from extremists in the past year.
Zahed, I'm so happy, I'm so excited to have you on to have this conversation. We met in Brussels a couple weeks ago, and I was just, not just fascinated, but the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, ISD, you guys are doing some fascinating and amazing work. And as we were talking, when we had supper, when we met that first night, I just kept thinking, oh my goodness, people need to hear this, and not just hear what you're doing, but hear about the way that you approach this. And yes, your ISD count is focused on counter messaging for extremists and that, but for the other, so my audience is kind of segregated. So I have government and then I have private sector. And both deal with crisis, obviously, that's why they tune in, but they also deal with different versions or different aspects within different types of crises, organizational crisis to, things like, for example, that you're dealing with. And either way, there's so many, as you talk, there's so many takeaways for both sides. So I kind of wanted to line it up for like that so that people listening can say, this does apply to me, even if they don't think that it does right off the onset. Not to mention that this is super, super fascinating, interesting work that you're doing. So tell us a little bit about, let's start it out. Let's talk a little bit about ISD. What is your mission?
Sure. Well, ISD is a think tank that's been around for close to a decade. And originally it started out dealing with policy in Europe in relation to the rest of the world. Very quickly, that started to, we started to look at extremism as a phenomenon. 7/7 happened shortly after, and we looked at it from a number of research and policy perspectives. But very, very quickly, ISD realized that they had to sort of build up tools, if you will, that could be used to help push back against extremism, and that's always a very tricky area to go into. Governments have tried with mixed degrees of success. The problem with extremism is that you're dealing with certain communities that don't respond well to government, whether it's from the right wing or Islamist or whatever. And you have to rely on civil society. And we were in the fortunate position of being a think tank, an independent organization, funded by institutions and individual donors and the private sector to sort of look at this phenomenon objectively. And very, very recently, we realized that we were in a position where we could coordinate between governments, between individual donors, between content creators, between the private sector, between networks, and provide a strategic resource for them. What has been happening out of the Middle East right now has been sort of a masterclass in propaganda. We're all familiar with sort of the traditional propaganda. Actually, the propaganda going on with Russia, for example. But in terms of propaganda orchestrated by states, and because with ISIS, we now have sort of a proto-state that is using propaganda in much the same way, with the aid of all the tools that they have at their disposal. The way they're orchestrating their propaganda is very much like statecraft. It's very, very multilateral. It's very sophisticated. It's very it's centralized, but the dissemination is so decentralized. It's really caught everyone off guard. So really, we've felt that now is the time to sort of put a lot of our research into action with a number of initiatives that are dealing with the online space and specifically, but also offline. And it goes back to the whole process of radicalization. I mean, our interest right now is stemming radicalization in Western countries, but also we're also concerned about the radicalization that happens in the Middle East and South Asia and so forth. But at the moment, our focus is in the West, and we've had some promising results from some of the campaigns that we've run. And one of the biggest lessons we've learned is that there is a role for the private sector in this. You wouldn't think so. You think extremism is something that only governments should have to deal with, even though they're not really that great at dealing with it.
Well, that's exactly it.
Yeah, because one thing we've seen with if you look at the messaging, one of the advantages of ISIS using social media is that we can see exactly what they're saying. There is still a lot of communication that's private and encrypted, but sort of the gateway is social media is very public. The propaganda that they have both aims to scare populations in the West and by extension their governments, but also to recruit people from those countries to either flee and go to to the Middle East or to conduct acts in their own countries. It's as I was saying, governments have tried to do it and they haven't been able to do it. So we've been ourselves have been going to the private sector asking for help, specifically social media companies. And one of the things we've been able to do is to get formal agreements with Google, Facebook, and Twitter to commit resources and engineers and in-kind support and finances to us to allow us to scale up counter-messaging campaigns on a broad scale. So we're now slowly trying to push back in a multilateral, in a multifaceted way, and see how it works. And hopefully it'll make a difference.
It's interesting because when you said you wouldn't think that non-government organizations would have a part in this or should have a part in this, I actually think the opposite. And you're right on when you say, government agencies, they're just not equipped to deal with it, whether that's because, bureaucracy is just too slow, or that's because the generational divide is way too big and
Absolutely.
They just don't get it. I mean, when we were, and I just wrote about this actually today, I published a blog kind of about my thinking on all of this from our time in Brussels. And I remember we were watching some brilliantly crafted, produced recruitment campaigns from ISIS that we were being shown. And we left the room after that session, and I was speaking with, some government people, ambassadors and diplomats, and one of them turned to me and he said, "I don't get it. They've got all of this money. Why was that film so badly produced?"
Yeah.
And that for me, it just sent off a light bulb that went, oh my goodness, no, you don't get it. And if you don't get it, how are you supposed to counter it?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that was particularly shocking in the last month or so, I mean, the film that was showed the burning of the Jordanian pilot was that was the peak of sophistication of something that ISIS produced. I mean, the impact in the West was extraordinary, and I think there's so much you can. When you study what was created and the sophistication and the technical mastery and also just the cultural understanding of what would engage young people, the computer animation, the drama and everything, as a recruitment film, it was horrifyingly effective. And what was interesting is that the Jordanians, of course, were so upset after that they had bombing runs, of course, to avenge their pilot's death. And they also released a video at the time to sort of show that they could play the same game. But the thing is, I mean, while of course they have a military advantage and they can send jets over there, the video was laughable in terms of propaganda value, and actually the highlight between what a government can produce and what was produced by ISIS was so stark. And I think for the most part, that's always going to be the case. And we should just accept that, that's not the role of government. Government has a role, but that role is on the back end. It's facilitating, it's helping coordinate different players who can produce a response, but it's not at the front end producing propaganda or messages.
No, it's not, and that's why it's so amazing, especially for me, to learn that there's organizations, there's think tanks like yours that are coming in and saying, "Hey, we can provide some value here. We can take a different approach." And you also don't have the same, regulations and all of these hurdles that government have, so you can be more proactive.
Absolutely. I'll give you two quick examples of what we've done. One of them is a campaign. We manage a network of former extremists called the Against Violent Extremism Network. We found that the reason this is done, this is a network that was actually seeded by Google, and we've taken over the management of it. And it's an incredible resource because these former extremists of all types of backgrounds, they kind of understand the radicalization process and how to come out of it as well. And they've given us a lot of the key ideas for campaigns that we're quietly doing. Now, the thing is, we don't fingerprint a lot of the work that we do, and this is one of the efficiencies of the private sector. The help that we've gotten from Google, Facebook, and Twitter it was very quick, it's very hands-off, and it's very they don't brand anything on the front end as well. They understand that aspect of it, so they just allow us to get on with it. And so one of the campaigns we found was an animated video campaign that was literally just a video sitting on YouTube by one of our members, and it was a really, really effective piece of animation. And we spoke to Google, and they helped us market the film, actually, and not just market it, but create different versions of it and study it and deploy it. And it was a film geared toward young people going to Syria, and they're not going to find a film on YouTube. So what they were able to do is to allow the film to be shown to any kid who was searching online through Google to go to Syria, and we knew their profiles, we knew where they were geographically located. So we were able to target the content to the at-risk audience. It wasn't about going viral or anything like that. It was about targeting a specific audience. And we were able to show different versions of the video and determine which ones worked better, what was the optimum length, what's the type of content that was more engaging, what was less engaging. So this is great data. Like, this is the stuff that you can apply to other campaigns. And the video went from nothing to 100,000 views of at-risk youth within 6 weeks.
Which is the most important thing. And I love that you just said that. I was going to bring it up later, that it's not about, in your work, it's not about going viral. It's about reaching the at-risk youth. Absolutely.
And it's a big misnomer that people have about counter-extremist messaging. It's because, there's a value for people knowing that it happens because, in our view, and we've seen it from our research, the extremism of the kind that's happening in the Middle East has an effect on far-right extremism. So actually attacking one extremism will possibly have an effect on the other types of extremism because they feed off each other. So so with that in mind, we have to start with the recruitment. What's interesting about that is that a lot of people. There's a lot of, for example, TV stations in the Middle East that are doing interesting stuff by mocking ISIS in their TV programs. That's sort of their media response, which is great, actually. They definitely don't like it.
Well, they're using satire.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great tool when you look at the general population. We're very interested in the people being recruited and the young kids being recruited. That's just our focus. And one of the film that I mentioned was so effective that essentially there was a 5,000-word rebuttal by ISIS through ISIS-linked Twitter accounts on an encrypted bulletin board that was rebutting the film that we had. So we figured that, it's one thing to attack them and make fun of them, but to go after the people that they're trying to recruit. Remember, they're losing 1,000 fighters every month, but they're gaining 1,000 recruits every month. So actually, if you do trim that inflow of recruits, it could have a serious effect on their ability to maintain their grip on power. So we're hoping that is a sign that more campaigns like this will either stem the recruits or just cause them to put their resources elsewhere, or disrupt them or whatever.
It's so important and it's so great. And one of the things that I love listening to you on the panel and now, I don't think that organizations, government agencies especially, but organizations that are focused on crisis and that have high risk of crisis impact and risk, they don't look at things like split testing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
They don't. You think of split testing for marketing campaigns, for PR campaigns,
well,
maybe,
absolutely.
but not for this type of. But at the same time, when you're trying to be targeted, and when the goal or the mission is so critical, you absolutely need, because you need to determine what works best, why, how, etc., so that you can duplicate that or replicate that 1,000 times fold. So can you talk a little bit about your experience there? Because I think that this is something new. For listeners listening, they might not have thought about this in terms of their crisis communications.
Absolutely. I'll step back a little bit and just point out that one of the interesting things we've learned about ISIS and their propaganda strategy is their ability to react to the way that their propaganda is received, modify their approach, and redeploy their stuff in a very, very short time frame. It's the kind of strategy we need to be using as well. At the moment, we sort of throw money, we throw content, it's all sort of very ad hoc. But if what we need to do is to every time we have a success, some evidence that we're seeing progress, we've got to learn from it, leverage it, and redeploy it in a very, very short time frame, because so much is happening so quickly, and especially with an adversary who knows what they're doing in terms of communication. They know what they're doing in terms of propaganda. If they overreach in sort of their brutality, they come back with, oh, life is great here, whatever. The propaganda aimed toward young girls, which is a new phenomenon, is very different than the propaganda that's aimed toward young men who want to go fight, because they won't allow the young women to go fight, but they know the young women who go have a role. And so they make that clear through their followers and through their supporters, and make it very seductive. In fact, the recruits who leave the West and go there themselves become the recruiters. Like Aqsa Mahmood, the teenager from Scotland who went over there, she basically was the one who recruited 3 British girls in the last few weeks who went to Syria.
Because it's relatable.
It's relatable, and they're not talking about beheadings or grabbing guns and fighting. They're talking about being pioneers. They're talking about you're going to get married to a handsome warrior. You're going to be taken care of. You're going to have all your needs taken care of. You'll have a sense of identity. It's powerful stuff, and the fact that we didn't see it coming shows that we've completely underestimated what we're dealing with here, and the power and the soft power of propaganda. So we need to deploy, learn, and redeploy. Like, we have to start doing it very, very quickly in a whole bunch of different areas. I'll just quickly mention before I forget, we just on the resilient side, because there's a spectrum of radicalization. You can target people who are close to leaving. They're at a different stage than sort of your general population who are just learning about what's going on in the world. So we launched 2 weeks ago, just before our White House summit, in Canada, a program called Extreme Dialogue, which you can see at extremedialogue.org. It's 2 films. It's soon to be more, that are sort of shown in classrooms with toolkits that we give to teachers, just to talk about extremism, sort of the same way that you talk about drugs or sex education, other difficult topics. We don't talk about extremism the same way. And the 2 films, one is a former neo-Nazi who sort of went into the movement and came back, and he tells his story. And the other is a mother of a young man who converted to Islam, went to Syria, and was killed there. Both very strong stories, and interestingly enough, both free of dogma. And, they're basically films to promote critical thinking and asking questions. The films would be shown and you'd identify very deeply with them. But in a classroom setting, you basically end up with lots of questions, and then you're in a great environment to deal with that. So that is something that we've worked with the Canadian government on that. We work with private sector filmmakers on that. And we're expanding that to the UK and Germany and Hungary this year.
Both films are beautifully produced.
Oh yeah, we're very, very proud of them. I think actually as art forms, they're spectacular, and we're very hopeful that we can replicate that.
Because it launched, it's been like 2 weeks now, correct?
Yeah.
2 or 3 weeks. How has the response been, or
It's been tremendous. Yeah. It's been tremendous. And one thing I can tell you that's been a big surprise is how many filmmakers, animators, film producers have come out of the blue to contact us just to donate their time and money and support or help in any way.
It's amazing.
It's amazing
that the world is coming together because we recognize the severity of the issue.
Absolutely. And that's the key. I think people don't realize that everyone can play a part in this, that there can be a society-wide response to this.
There needs to be a society-wide response.
Absolutely. And even if you think that, I'm not in that geographic area, or I'm not of that ethnicity or religion, or I'm not whatever, actually, you know what? Everyone has a part to play. And so we're very, very heartened to see the response. And in Canada, I mean, the press has been great. The response from teachers have been great. I think we're very quickly going to be overwhelmed in the sense that, there's more demand for us to sort of help put these programs in every school, then we have the ability.
But that's amazing. That means you'll get funding.
It's a great problem.
And then
exactly.
You can expand.
Absolutely. And that's a great problem to have. We were very fortunate to, we were in talks with a lot of potential individual donors right before the launch of Extreme Dialogue and our White House Summit. And I have to tell you that everyone's been so impressed and so eager to help, which is really, really a great place to be.
Absolutely. And I want to get back to the split testing, but you said something, and it's something that you're right, that it is in your Extreme Dialogue videos. It's also in some other campaigns. You really are promoting critical thinking. And I think that that's a really strong approach because you're helping people think for themselves rather than get brainwashed.
It's always the better option is to give young people the tools to analyze their world by themselves, and not rely on people telling them what to do. I mean, it's whether it's extremism or anything else, it's good to put extremism in this mix because people don't often think of it as something that sometimes they think it's black or white. Actually, there is a lot of shades of gray, and people need to understand all the nuances and so forth. But that to us is the best way to sort of inoculate young people is to have them think critically about what the issues mean so that they can pass that resilience onto their peers.
Is there a way, so I'm thinking as you're promoting this critical thought, and you're planting the seeds, I mean, some campaigns that I've seen, you're really asking hard questions that if you're on the verge, so wherever you are in the spectrum of recruitment, for example, and you're closer to almost leaving, you're at a stage where you're sold. You're sold too.
Absolutely.
And so some of the critical thinking or the seed planting for thought, for that critical thinking that you're planting in some of these communications and counter narratives, they're asking really difficult questions that are really, really important. But at the same time, when you hear it being asked, because a lot of it, you're actually asking it in the form of a question where, for example, you have a character who's thinking out loud, asking him or herself, and the listener is thinking and going, hey, that's true. How come? Right? Yeah. So you're provoking that thought. Now, is there a way for to continue that dialogue somehow, to make that two-way? So those who have that thought, where do they go next, or to find? Go ahead.
Well, it's good that you mentioned that because one of the other programs that we're trialing at the moment, we're doing this in partnership with a university in Australia, is we found from our research with former extremists that as you're at that sharper end of the spectrum, as that door is closing, that door of critical thought is closing, The opportunities, your exposure to counter messaging, you become more immune to that. And one of the only things that could really help is actually having one-to-one interaction with people, like having actual conversations with people who can walk you off the ledge. And so we're trialing this very interesting program where we basically use graph search on Facebook to identify people who are clearly flirting, if not beyond that, with extremism. And it's great that we have access to these tools, and actually with our partnerships now with these companies, we might have some behind-the-scenes tools to use. But when we identify these people, we basically connect them with a former extremist who accepts the challenge of reaching out to them to see if they want to talk. And we basically expect at the beginning of this to have maybe a 10% response rate. Most people would just ignore it. So we've had about a 35 to 40% response rate. And not only that, we've expected a lot of those responses to be hostile, and actually we haven't had any hostility. So actually, surprisingly, because of the way that these people have approached these others on Facebook, they've done it in a way that there's no hostile response. And actually, one very interesting case is when a person said, "You know what? Thanks, I'm fine. I don't need your help." 2 weeks later, responded to the same guy and said, "Actually, you know what? I'm in a bad place. I do need some help."
Wow.
So that at the very sharpest end, that's a little bit more resource intensive to do that. But just the fact that it can work, that there was no other way to reach this person. I mean, these people, they're living online. We know the young people who flee their families, nobody had any idea because their whole lives were living online. And the fact that we've seen some promising results in this space, combined with the resilience building in schools and combined with the social media campaign and targeting with films, we're trying to cover all parts of the spectrum. Now, as you were going back to sort of split testing, every one of these approaches has to be, split into different facets, and each of them tested in a way that we can learn what's optimal. And that optimal state may be for a particular medium, it may be for a typical geographical area, it may be for specific content. But either way, it's just, it's a great way to learn what works. And that, because that data is independent of the message, we can just apply it to everything else that we do. And so all of this strategic organization is basically what our role is. We don't create content. We don't get the networks. We don't produce our own money. We have to seek that funding as well. But if we can combine our strengths and our strategic management with all these other resources people can bring to the table. And as I mentioned before, the more people learn, the more people come to us and are saying, "I want to help." So the more we can do that, hopefully we can scale this thing up pretty quickly.
Which is so important. As you're talking about the response and the positive response you've received from people reaching out for help once they've seen some campaigns and gotten to that point, the biggest thing, I guess, characteristic that keeps coming back, and it's something that I spoke about at the NATO Forum, it's something that I blog about, is that relatability factor. I mean, no other person than somebody who has been in their shoes and come back from it could get through at that point, and they wouldn't want to speak with anybody else.
Yeah. And that is critically important. I think we're so used to a one-size-fits-all solution. We're so used to finding something that works and say, "Great, make it go viral, let it get 10 million views, let it." This is just a different space for that, because there is. I'll give you an example. The campaign that we supported, the video campaign, the animation campaign, it was created by a former extremist who is a British Muslim of a sort of Pakistani background. And he made it specifically for British Muslim youth because he understood, the language is British, the references are British, and the mentality, because I mean he understood, the cultural aspect of his peers being drawn into extremism. And interestingly enough, I showed the video at a YouTube summit in Los Angeles in January to a group of American Muslims, and a lot of them were like, okay, this is well produced, this is really whatever, but it kind of doesn't speak to me. And I was telling them, it's not actually meant to speak to you. This is meant to speak to a specific audience by someone who understands that audience. The solution for Americans would be, something that is culturally American, or something that speaks to sort of the identity of an American. And that's okay. I mean, we have to understand those facets in order to communicate effectively. Otherwise, this is just not. It's not one thing scaled, to a huge level. It's a small thing scaled infinitely on a lateral basis.
It's very true, and it's very important. And I think it's a big part of what's missing on the government side in terms of their comprehension and their realization, their understanding.
I will give credit. This summit that happened in Washington, it's actually something we were trying to get to happen behind the scenes since the middle of last year, and there was always sort of pushback, sort of I'm not sure, do we really need this, and so forth. And it was the Charlie Hebdo attacks that changed everything. In fact, it was Eric Holder who went to Paris, and as he was there, said, "We're going to have this summit in a month." And of course, then we were scrambling to, and to his credit, President Obama met with a lot of people, and took advice from us and others on certain aspects of counter messaging, using credible messengers, considering the use of former extremists in the counter messaging, which is controversial. And the role of government, and where it should be, and so forth. And to his credit, he used a lot of those points in his speech that he never used before. So I think we're seeing from the top down an understanding that, right, there is a role for government, but there needs to be a better understanding of the players who can actually make a solution happen, and government has to give that support, but also stay on the sidelines. So I think that the global framework is shifting towards this type of solution. So because that's the case, I think it'll pave our way to having some impact, I hope.
I think so, or I hope so, but I think so. I think that your results speak for themselves, and if you care about this mission, if you care about this situation, this issue, then you can't ignore it. It's unignorable. Absolutely. So, and there, the proof is in what you're doing and how it's working.
Absolutely.
So in terms of all of this, I guess I'd like to ask, what's the biggest lesson, thinking back to everything that you've been working on, you've done, you've seen, you tried to predict. I mean, you've mentioned that nobody really saw the female recruitment campaigns coming. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if you think about it, what are they trying to do? They're trying to create a population.
Absolutely.
It only makes sense.
Absolutely. There's many lessons that we're learning, but that lesson that we look at Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization, but ISIS is not so much a terrorist organization as a rogue state, mm-hmm. and they operate in that manner, and we failed to see that they were going to look beyond guerrilla tactics and logistics. They were looking toward governance and legitimacy and those kind of very permanent things. I remember in the middle of last year when they came on the scene and announced their caliphate, that people weren't really taking it as seriously as they should have. But I think now people understand that we've underestimated what's happening, and that everyone has to adjust their expectations, but also their strategies and how to push back. And I think to everyone's credit, we have, as much as we haven't foreseen these phenomena, I think they're widely known, especially within the field of people countering violent extremism. People do understand exactly what's happening now, and I think really now the focus is what can help stem that tide. So it is a very, very unique place to be at the moment, and really we have to prove that that everything that people have suffered has not gone in vain. We have to learn from it and actually try to stem the tide.
Well said. It's there. From what I saw, I mean, the biggest thing I think. Well, there's a couple big things that I took away from the conference, from the forum in Brussels. But the biggest thing I think was just how brilliant and petrifyingly brilliant ISIS is.
Yeah.
It's
absolutely.
It's astonishing. It opened my eyes immensely, and even just comparing, propaganda and recruitment campaigns, for example, between ISIS and Al Qaeda.
Yeah,
it's night and day.
Absolutely,
they just get something about it, and we need to get that too.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and again, I'm hopeful. I mean, even ISIS's rivals are learning from them.
Of course.
And again, I mean, the sad thing about all this is that they don't have anything we don't have. They have nothing in terms of talent or resources or equipment or know-how, whatever, that we don't have. It's just that we have to have the passion to fight back the way that they have to fight us. So
it's interesting, and something stuck with me when so I watched a video of a presentation that your CEO did. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, so her name is Sasha
Havlicek.
Okay, thank you. I have it written in front of me. I'm like, no, I don't think I'm going to do that justice. She said something, and I'm paraphrasing, but she said something along the lines of, these organizations, these groups, they're using the tools that we created in the free world. They're using our open source. They're using our social media. They're using our tools better than we are at the moment. I mean, I do believe that because of organizations like ISD, that we're going to catch up, and that we're going to, and also spreading awareness that anybody who feels a calling or feels a passion or a need or an urge or whatever it is to come and do something, I think that that's a big message. I think that's a big call to action.
Yeah, and I'm gonna throw this out there as well, because this is another thing. One of the things that I'm keenly interested in. It would be very easy, if you were so inclined, to push this the wrong way in terms of becoming political or actually alienating Muslim communities from this struggle, depending on how you approach the problem. I think, I feel that one of the reasons I'm sort of proud to work with ISD is because they've always been very objective in how they approach extremism.
It's really important.
It really is important because, right now we're seeing that a lot of the credible messengers and the talent and whatever we need come from the communities that are being recruited, to, and we cannot lose their trust, and we need them to be partners. And as I was saying before, we need everyone has a part to play, but we particularly need people from the communities who are vulnerable to be a part of this. And so we have to approach this responsibly and not lose their trust, because that will hurt the whole effort.
Which is a big reason to not turn to government, or not turn into some form of government funded organization, for example.
Exactly. To the extent that you deal with theology, for example, that's that would absolutely fall flat with a government message. You actually need people who are theologically sound and who understand theology to fight back on the theological justifications that are being used for extremism. And so we can't turn around and blame all Muslims, for example. We have to understand that that they have a part to play in this. That's another problem within the problem. I mean, the more that, and it's a problem of ignorance, but it's a problem that needs to be educating just the general public in the sense that there's a difference between Muslims and terrorists. Absolutely. Absolutely. Fundamentally,
yes,
there is. And we've had scholars, for example, push back on the way that ISIS uses Islam, but clearly we need to package that and use it and support it and whatever in a way that really resonates. Because right now they're just ad hoc things happening here and there on a small scale. And without that scaling up, that message doesn't get out.
Well, and it stigmatizes when, again, it goes to a lack of education or lack of understanding, but we need to tackle that. And I know that that's not necessarily your goal, but at some level, there needs to be, not you guys necessarily, because it's very important that you stay focused on what your goal is because you're getting somewhere with it. But in sense of looking at this crisis as a whole, you don't want other crises to develop where there's hate crimes, for example,
Precisely.
on innocent Muslims because there's a lack of understanding there. There's a lack of education there.
Yeah. Well, we actually do understand that these are all interconnected, and we have had a lot of initiatives dealing with Islamophobia and so forth. So actually, we do actually look at it in a very interconnected way. But because extremism is a very, very specific crisis, we are putting resources into that specifically. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Everything is interconnected, and you don't want other crises to come in and undermine all the work.
No, absolutely not. So, where can people find more information? How can they reach out if they say, hey, I'm in one of these categories or groups, or I just want to learn what I can do to help? Where can they go?
Well, the easiest thing would be to go to our website, which is strategicdialogue.org, or you can go to our Twitter feed and so forth. We are always looking for people who are content creators who have great ideas, because as we get funding for campaigns, these ideas will have the ability to put them into action, or just anyone who has an interest in this area and can have maybe connections to resources or networks that would be useful. Any of that would be great, and you can just find out more on our website.
And I'm also going, because I have a lot of professors and teachers and educational institutions that follow me. So I'm going to also include a link in the show notes to extremedialogue.org because that
Fantastic.
is specifically targeted to our educational systems.
Yeah. Also, data analytics, that kind of stuff. Big on our list, so anyone who's interested in that.
I wanted to ask you, actually, probably just maybe a minute or two.
Sure.
So we mentioned that you get help from Google, Facebook, Twitter. I think that maybe there's people listening saying, "Well, what are they doing? How do they help?"
Well, I mean, the short answer is either if it's not financing, it's technical expertise on using their platforms. So either we have access to their platforms in a way the general public doesn't, and that it's in regards to campaigns that we deploy, or we provide training through all three to people who are creating campaigns so that they know how best to use those platforms to get their campaigns out there. So, I mean, that's just a couple of the ways that they help. But it's still a trial phase. We've had a longer relationship with Google, but really, this is if this works out, then it's not often that you have the three social media companies sort of on working with the same entity, but
it shows a social responsibility that
absolutely.
They're taking, and that's huge.
It is huge, and we really want to make sure that it's rewarded in the sense that we produce good content.
That you meet your mission, that you're successful.
Yeah. Yes.
Zahed, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. And all of your links will be below, no matter where anybody's listening to it from, whether you're listening on melissaagnes.com, iTunes, or Stitcher. You can find all of this information below this recording. So thank you, Zahed.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to this week's episode of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast with me, Melissa Agnes. I release a new episode every Sunday, so if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to this Crisis Intelligence Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher so you don't miss out on any future episodes. While you're at it, feel free to leave me a rating or review on iTunes. This will go such a long way in helping me get this important information to more people just like you to help benefit their crisis management and crisis communications. Additionally, if you'd like to have me come and speak at an upcoming event that you may be organizing, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. You can email me at melissa@melissaagnes.com. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and I look forward to talking even more crisis intelligence with you next Sunday.